Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am Joe. He's Nick, and you are listening to The Nick and Joe Show for June 30th, 2021. The Eve, Canada Day Eve, I guess is one way to put it. And I am in the Think Radio Broadcast Center in Ottawa. Nick is in the radio studio in Killaloe, Ontario. And we've been running into a few issues, not unusual if you've listened to the show. Then you know, okay. Nick and Joe sometimes run into technical issues, and they are really good at dealing with those issues. So we're just doing that, but we have been navigating this incredible latency that's developed, and I think we got to the bottom of it, but I don't know what's going to happen out there. Anyway, it hasn't stopped us from doing the show, just that, you know, we've had some gaps when I've shut up and we're listening, waiting for Nick to jump in. But before Nick jumps in or whatever, two things. I'm going to introduce the topic, but before I do that, just a housekeeping. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to the show online, then you can participate in our live chat room, and you do that by clicking on the chat bubble or comment bubble in the player. And that, if you haven't registered before, you may have to register. If you have registered but you haven't logged in, you may have to log in. All of that is just to ensure that you are a real flesh and blood human being. We do not share any of your personal information, email addresses, or anything like that, and it costs nothing. It's absolutely free. So, you know, please take advantage. We love to follow, see what people are saying in our chat room, and it's been the last few weeks pretty darn lively, I have to say. Anyways, wanted to get into this topic to change course a little bit. Here in Ontario, there's a piece of legislation that was introduced by the Ontario government some time ago, and that was to ban unions or any third-party organization, for that matter, from spending money on political ads, etc., for 1 year, up to 1 year, that's 12 months, prior to the holding of a scheduled general election. Now, for those of you out there that don't know, we are in the Westminster system of government, which means that a sitting government can precipitate an election at any time. Okay, there's no constitutional prohibition against doing that. The Constitution requires that we have elections every 5 years, but the standard practice has been that we have them every 4 years and that they're scheduled. Unless something happens, you have a minority government or the government falls, etc. But we do have a schedule of elections. And we, in one of the things that has occurred in the past is that third-party organizations, groups, you know, industrial groups, associations, leading into a general election that's scheduled so that they know the timing, etc., that they spend, you know, a fair amount of money coming up with election-related ads in support of a particular policy, against a particular policy, in support of a particular political party or candidates, against the political party or candidates, that kind of spending. And a few election cycles ago, the government passed legislation dictating that you could only spend a certain amount of money, so it was limiting the amount of money that you could spend, only under certain conditions, and within 6 months of a general election. Now, that was federally. And provincially, we adopted similar legislation. However, there are organizations, and in particular, union-funded groups. In Ontario, there's a group called Working Families, which is principally union-funded, that they spend a lot of money, and when they're able to. And so the government of Ontario, the Conservative government under Doug Ford, or shall I say the nominally Conservative government under Doug Ford, wrote legislation extending the period of time, limiting the amount of money that could be spent from 6 months to 12 months. Okay. So they were sued. There was a constitutional challenge, and a lower court determined that this was unconstitutional. I don't want to get into whether or not that's a reasonable ruling. Okay, let's just take it at face value the way it is. The response by the Ontario government, by the Ford government, rather than appealing the decision, which I would have thought would have been the proper course of action, but that's a minor point. They've decided that they're going to reintroduce the legislation the way it was written, the new legislation that was just struck down by this lower court. Rather than appealing it, we're just going to reintroduce it, but we're going to attach to it the so-called notwithstanding clause. Now, for those of you who don't know, particularly our international listeners, in Canada we have, in our Constitution, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have Section 33, which is otherwise known as the notwithstanding clause, which allows a government, a legislature, to suspend the provisions of the Constitution as it applies to any single piece of legislation for 5 years. After 5 years, you have to renew by a motion in the legislature that exemption, if you want to call it that. So what essentially the Ford government is going to do is they're saying, well, we're going to reintroduce this legislation. We're going to attach to it the notwithstanding clause. So that way, even if the courts believe that this is unconstitutional, they can't strike it down. Notwithstanding the fact, that's why we call it the notwithstanding effect clause. Notwithstanding the fact that the court, that this is unconstitutional, it remains in full effect. So that's the argument that they're using. So here's the problem that I have with that. I don't understand why the Ford government or other governments in Canada simply say, with respect to union spending, look, unions could spend money on election advertising like every other third party can, but you can't spend union dues on election advertising. In other words, you have to raise the money individually from your membership through whatever fundraising drive, subscription, etc. And members can choose to contribute to this fund that you're going to use for advertising, or they can choose not to contribute. For those people for those unions with mandatory dues, and that's sort of the way it goes here in Canada, we have what's called the RAND formula. So that one option is you go to the members and you say, can you contribute? The second option is that you say to your members, we are going to spend X number of dollars, or we propose to spend X number of dollars from your dues on this advertising campaign. Do you agree with that portion of your dues as an individual member of the union? Do you agree with this? If you don't agree with it, let us know, and we will reimburse you that portion of your dues which would have gone into this particular election campaign. And what it is it's all about saying to unions, okay, we get it. Mr. Justice Rand in 1947, in his famous ruling, arbitration ruling, said, it's reasonable for members, for employees to have to pay into the union to support the union's collective bargaining activities, even if they're not members of the union, because they benefit from the activities of the union. But that only makes sense if the union is only spending money on collective bargaining activities. So the key here is not to limit the ability of the union to spend money, which I think is, I really do believe is an infringement on free speech. I think that the key here is that the government should be basically saying that you can't spend your members' dues on activities that are not related to collective bargaining, particularly when you're talking about spending dues on political advertising, because you could theoretically have members of the union who are card-carrying members of, say, the Conservative government, who pay their dues and are compelled to pay dues to the union. They can't get out of it. By law, they must pay the dues to the union. And then the union turns around and takes those dues, takes a portion of them, and campaigns actively against the political party that some of their members belong to. So in my view, that's a complete conflict of interest, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it. So just ban union spending of dues on anything but collective bargaining, and let them spend money on advertising, but let them raise that money amongst the union members, their own membership amongst the people who want to go ahead and contribute to this. And if they can't raise that money, then they don't get to contribute. Now, one last thing on this, and that is that the pushback that you're going to get from the government, that we would get from the government if we were going to them and saying this is what they should do, the pushback that we're going to get from them is, yeah, but that this is already, the RAND formula has already been challenged in court, and it's been found to be constitutional. We can't tinker with the RAND formula. And my response to that is, but you're invoking the notwithstanding clause with this other method. So, I mean, if you're going to invoke the notwithstanding clause, why don't you do it in a way that gives workers the freedom to spend their own money on political activities of their own choosing? I think that's a far more reasonable approach to take.
If you strike down the idea that they can, or you make it illegal for them to use dues, you really cripple the power of the unions when it comes to advertising. And that's fine with me, because I don't like people who, like, when I've been in a union in at least one case in my life, and I was told in no uncertain terms that I had to spend $40 a month and I didn't have a choice if I wanted to work at that particular establishment. All right, so that made me a member of the union. That didn't make me an NDP. That didn't make me, want to give voluntarily my dues to fund programs and advertising that go against the things that I believed in. And what happens is when you do that, when you say, okay, you're going to have to come up with the money from whatever pool of resources you have, but membership dues are there for strike pay, and they're there for benefits packages. They are not there for political activism, and you're never going to see that happen. If you did that, you would have every union leader in the street screaming for a revolution. I mean, let's just be honest about it. It's all about the money. It's all about the power that comes with that money and how they go about getting it. Unions, in my mind, and I'm being hard on unions, I'm not, in theory, I'm not against having unions. There's certain situations where they certainly have made a big difference in the past, but I think those days are gone. And to be able to just reach into somebody's pocket and pull out $40, $60, $100, whatever the dues are for that particular institution a month, that piles up pretty quickly. And the next thing you know, you've got a multi-million-dollar fund, and it's being used against a party that you would normally vote for if you were allowed to vote your conscience and not worry about what your leadership in the union had to say about it.
Right. You, I think, have described the situation exactly correctly. And I'm not for limiting free speech, and I'm not taking an anti-union approach to this. I'm just saying that, again, workers ought to have the right to decide where their money is being spent when it comes to political activities. This is a fundamental right in a democracy. The right to participate in the political, in politics, and to do it according to your own conscience. And, again, as I've said, even if the Ford government, what they're proposing, goes through, it doesn't stop unions from participating, as I say, in political advertising during the period that would not be covered by this quote-unquote blackout or this unregulated period. So you're treating the symptom, not the cause. And the cause here is, again, that we allow unions in this country to take mandatory dues and use them for all kind of activities not related to collective bargaining. And we've been talking here simply about spending union